He's live in Singapore. I tell you what, he just had a piece out. It's a really great piece. And the title is even better. It's Dialogue of the Deaf. Drives escalating U.S.-Iranian tensions. Just out today on Inside Arabia. That's my number one choice. That's where I go. InsideArabia.com for all the news on the Middle East. As you know, I cover it. InsideArabia.com, based in D.C. James Dorsey, live in Singapore. James, thank you for your patience. Thanks for being with us.
John, always a pleasure to be with you.
I saw your piece pop up on my phone last night, 2 days ago. I think it was Tuesday night, and I started to laugh. Dialogue of the Deaf drives escalating U.S.-Iranian tensions. Of course, it's getting worse now since I came out. But let me start with what's the most important question. How's your wife?
She's doing well. It's a waiting game. We're waiting for her to test twice negatively, and then she's back home. And
Good.
That could be any day now.
Good. I'm so glad.
Thank you for asking.
We'll be keeping tabs on it. James Dorsey, InsideArabia.com. What is going on we got the president tweeting out yesterday he's going to blow Iranian gunboats out of the water. Pompeo follows up and he escalates what the president said and said they have basically what he said, I'm interpreting it, a zero tolerance policy. What's going on here, James?
It's basically more of the same. And essentially, the Americans are misreading Iran and walking into what I would call an Iranian trap. So, with other words, for the last 4 decades, the United States and Iran have talked past each other. There are deep-seated perceptions of one another that are not totally inaccurate, but they're also not totally accurate. So the United States sees Iran as a rogue player wanting to destabilize. Iran looks at the United States and everything the United States does as aiming to overthrow the regime in Tehran. And so that's what they act on. Now, if you understand what the Iranians are trying to do and why they're doing it this way, you may act differently. The Iranians, following the withdrawal by the Trump administration from the Iran nuclear agreement, spent about a year trying to pressure Washington to return to the negotiating table. It didn't work. And it was clear to them that that was not going to work. And so they adopted a strategy of what they call gradual escalation. And that's what they've been doing. And the gradual escalation is based on the assumption that neither the United States nor Iran wants an all-out war. So therefore, if you bring the two countries to the brink of war, one of the two will blink, and you then can sit down and talk. That's what happened with in December, January, basically ending with the killing of the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani. The Americans believed that they had deterred Iran, and they could only believe that because they misread Iranian strategy. The Iranians gave it a little bit of time. They also had other things to deal with, including the downing of the Ukrainian passenger plane. And then they picked it up again. And so now you're getting the gradual escalation. And the danger, of course, is that it gets out of hand.
What is the incentive here? Like, why are the Iranians doing this? I mean, we're in the middle of this pandemic. The president's got other things to do. So does the vice president. Nobody's really focused now on our conflicts there. What is their objective here in stoking up this tension when basically they could be off the radar screen for a while?
It's for them not about being off the radar screen. I mean, you can argue whatever you want, but the U.S. sanctions certainly complicate Iran's access to medical equipment and technology and knowledge that they need. They were, until a few days ago, the country worst hit outside of the United States, Europe, and China. That's one. Two, don't forget that the pandemic causes economic downturn, serious economic downturn for almost every country in the world, but probably no worse in Iran than because of U.S. sanctions. So they've got nothing to lose. And for them, this is as much about fighting the pandemic as it is trying to force the United States to the negotiating table. Keep in mind that there were only very few countries, in part some for political reasons, but many because of fear of U.S. sanctions, who have not come to Iran's aid in fighting the pandemic.
Let's say the U.S., let's play this out. We're with James Dorsey, senior contributor, Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com, my source for news and information in the Middle East. That's number one source, best analysis, based in Washington, D.C., InsideArabia.com. James Dorsey, senior contributor based in Singapore. So, James, let's play this out worst case. So, the Iranians' objective is to get us to the negotiating table. They want to get rid of these sanctions. They continue rattling a saber. Somebody blinks. We blow up, I don't know, one of their war boats or whatever. We blow one of those out of the ocean. What happens? How does that get them to the negotiating table?
With other words, you escalate. And there's a point in that escalation, if you can control the escalation, where your only next step is an all-out attack, something that would provoke an all-out war. Mm-hmm. That's where the Iranians want to get to, because they're convinced that they know that they don't want an all-out war, nor can they afford one, and they firmly believe that Trump does not want an all-out war. So they're trying to create a situation in which there are no alternatives except for all-out war or negotiate.
So they're playing a zero-sum game for negotiation, almost like mutual assured destruction, right? Remember during the Soviet negotiations, they could destroy us, we could destroy them. Neither country would destroy the other. Therefore, you have to negotiate.
Let me throw another thought of you, and keep in mind
yes, sir.
that in some ways the paradigm or the playing field has shifted towards the Iranians, mm-hmm. particularly because of the pandemic and because of the economic fallout and the oil price war. Mm-hmm. Their opponents, so Saudi Arabia first and foremost, are facing several years of depressed oil demand and depressed oil prices. This is no longer going to be the Saudi Arabia that we have been dealing with in the past. So in that sense, this is not, this has been a strategy that they've been pursuing that predates the pandemic and the economic collapse. But now they're in some ways in a stronger position than they have been before.
Because we have a much weakened economic position, and so Saudis. I mean, the Saudis issue is they need $80 a barrel to balance their budget. Right now it's selling it at, 10? And then the other problem they have is they can't make it up in volume because demand is like collapsed, right? Nobody's going out, so nobody's demanding fuel. So what you're saying is the Iranians, because of the economic crisis, are now in a better situation negotiating-wise, right?
That's one part of it. There are two other parts to it. One is that the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, has to produce in terms of jobs and economic prospects. The current economic situation and the projections for the oil markets are not promising him the money that he needs. So he's weakened in that sense. On top of that, because of the pandemic, Saudi Arabia, the custodian of Islam's two holiest cities, has to cancel pilgrimages, including the Hajj, closes down mosques. So its leadership of the Muslim world is being undermined, not only economically but also, in a sense, spiritually. So, with other words, this has, as great as the hardship is, it does give Iran a strategic advantage, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be exploiting it.
So what is our objective here? If you're Secretary of State Pompeo, that's been dealing with this since he's got there, what is our objective with Iran? We put the sanctions on them. The president says, I have one objective, no nuclear capability, warhead capability. Okay, I get that. But they don't have that capability. Pompeo and Trump are upset that they continue to foment terrorist acts and destabilize governments around. But that's been going on since before Christ. So I'm failing to see now what is our objective other than stop them from getting nuclear weapons. What's our
Well,
what's the U.S. objective now with Iran?
First of all, my feeling is that even if it's not a declared objective, the goal is to change the regime in Tehran. So it's not going to be through military intervention. It's not going to be primarily through covert action. It's going to be through economic strangulation, that you get to the point where Iranians start a protest against the government, and ultimately that leads to the government's fall. Fact of the matter is that despite the fact that you've had mass protests in Iran over the last year, that there is a significant degree of distrust between the government and the public. Fact is that the 2 years of sanctions, very harsh sanctions, have not worked. And there's no sign that they will work anytime soon. So the question is whether that's an effective strategy. In terms of nuclear capability, Iran was limited in its ability to develop nuclear weapons as long as you had the Iran Accord in place. The Iranians have very gradually walked away from that accord after the U.S. withdrawal. And the gradualness of that walking away was designed to leave the door open for a return to the accord. So now you have a situation where they're not bound by restrictions on enrichment levels, and their enrichment levels have risen significantly. I think, again, the thing to understand about Iran, and whether you like the regime or not, this is a regime that feels that and it made major mistakes at the beginning, the occupation of the U.S. embassy and so forth. But it's fundamentally a regime that feels that it has been under siege for the last 40 years. And it's not just the United States. We talk about Saudi funding of ultra-conservative strands of Islam. The reason, one main driver for that was countering Iran. So what you have with the pandemic is an opportunity to try and build some bridges, to try and change some perceptions, to try and build a degree of confidence that allows you to have a much more sensible negotiation. What we have now is that that we have two parties with preconditions for negotiation, none of those preconditions being acceptable to any of the parties.
We're with James Dorsey. James is senior contributor for InsideArabia.com. That's my source for news and information analysis in the Middle East. Go to InsideArabia.com, the best site you're going to find. They're based in Washington, D.C. James, based in Singapore. James, let me just ask you this. I know you're a student of history. When was the last time the U.S., the State Department, the CIA, or any other entity that we've had operating covertly around the world, when is the last time the U.S. was actually successful in a regime change?
The one that comes to my mind, and that's very much also shaping Iranian attitudes, is 1953 Iran. But the point is not whether the Americans have a successful track record of a regime change. They have sent significant enough signals that that's what they're interested in. John Bolton was very clear about it, frankly, and he was National Security Advisor for a while. The relationships between many in the Trump administration, but also within the Democratic Party and past Democratic administrations, with a group like the Mujahideen Khalq, which is an exile Iranian cult, basically, that calls for regime change. And that those relationships mean that people like Pompeo, people like Giuliani show up at the meetings of these of this group and call for regime change. So it's not so much whether or not the Iranians should be looking at this and saying, doesn't really matter what the Americans say. They're not good at it anyways. Fact of the matter is that they see this as U.S. policy, and there's reason to believe it.
This is fantastic analysis. I mean, look, if you're the Iranians sitting there, I mean, that's they believe that the U.S. Objective, which it probably is regime change. This is much to my chagrin. As you know, I'm a Trump supporter. One of the things that was key in the campaign when I was there was he used to say over and over, we're getting out of the regime change business. It's just not a good business to be in. It's failed every time we tried to do it. It creates enemies. Nothing's ever worked. We're going to get out of the regime change business. But we never really got out of the regime change business in Iran. Enter John Bolton, never Trumper, neocon, warmonger. He foments it, and now we're in the situation that we're in. Makes no sense.
Obviously, in contrast to you, I'm not a Trump supporter.
Yes.
But having said that, you've got to give, if you look past over the last year and a half, you've got to give Trump credit in that Iran was pushing the strategy. It was attacking U.S. targets in Iraq multiple times. Mm-hmm. You had the attack on the tankers off the coast of the Emirates. You had the attack on the Saudi oil fields. Mm-hmm. Trump did not respond. Mm-hmm. He was adopting what the Iranians earlier had adopted and then changed, namely strategic patience. Mm-hmm. And that changed, of course, with the killing of an American contractor in December of last year, and then the Qasem Soleimani killing. So, with other words, for quite a while, the Iranians could have read that the Trump administration was holding back. Mm-hmm. The problem with that was that was all that the administration was doing. There was no direct, indirect reaching out to Iran and say, look, let's not get this out of hand. Let's try and figure out a way in which we can talk.
Great analysis, James. I don't know where we go from here. We have to keep following this story. But I think you're right. At the end of the day, there's got to be a negotiation because nobody wants the other alternative. So it gets turned into a zero-sum game, and the zero-sum is you have to sit down at the table. We want a regime change. Not going to happen. They want to get rid of the sanctions. Probably they have the advantage in doing that because the regime is not going to get changed. I got to roll. I want to thank James Dorsey, live in Singapore, for being with us. Senior contributor to Inside Arabia. Go to InsideArabia.com. Hey, James, as always, great analysis on the situation. I got to go, but let me just ask you one other thing. Let's get a timeline here, right? I mean, obviously, if you're the Iranians and you want to get to the negotiating table, now's your window, right? Oil prices dropping. President's got an economic catastrophe on his hands, a pandemic on his hands, and complete energy sector fallout on his hands. Country's got another stimulus package coming. We're fighting over what states get opened. I mean, the whole thing is a catastrophe economically. Doesn't Iran have a strategic window now?
It has a strategic window, but it takes two to tango. The United States is fundamentally not willing to sit down with the Iranians unless they surrender certain things. This is a country, and again, it's not a question of defending them, but it's a question of understanding. This is a country that feels, and has been, for all practical matters, under siege for the last 4 decades. Mm-hmm. Its military capabilities, I mean, look, they just sent up a satellite in this mess, economic sanctions, economic downturn, pandemic. Mm-hmm. They need to choose alternative forms of defense, mm-hmm. which are their proxies. Ballistic missiles is the only real thing they have in their armory. Mm-hmm. And so unless you start a process in which you make clear there's room for talk and there has to be understanding on both parts, including an American understanding that Iran has to have a defense capability, mm-hmm. And you talk about how you arrange that, you're not going to get out of the woods. It's as simple as that.
James Dorsey, thanks for being with us.